Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the Ontario government will spend $250 million to liberalize beer and wine sales in corner stores. The opposition says it's more like $1 billion, and it's a waste of money.
The Premier's employees are supposed to use official government email accounts to communicate with one another. Turns out, many are using their private Gmail accounts, possibly to avoid public scrutiny.
An historic moment in the legislature this week. An MPP asked a question, not in English, not in French, but in Oji-Cree for the first time ever. In your column, my column, I'll tell you why Doug Ford is refusing to rule out an early election call.
And I'll ask whether an early election is really a good idea given their record on housing. It's Friday, May 31st, 2024, so let's get to it.
Hey, partner.
Hello.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I know that the first thing that you thought of when I walked onto the set was, I wonder why he's wearing that 17 North shirt.
A lot of your sweaters have Highway 17 themes, and I'm curious about this one.
Well, I'm wearing Highway 17 North today because I was on Highway 17 North earlier this week. We did, what did we do? We did a couple of shoots for the agenda up in Sault Ste. Marie and a couple of editions of TVO Today Live, which is the thing we do in front of a live audience out in the community. And we drove by. I think, actually, Sheldon, you got this? You want to put this picture up? I was driving on 17 North with Stacey Dunseith, who's from the Sioux, executive producer of this very program. And we saw this place, and look at this. I mean, does that not scream Highway 17 North, come on in here, buy a shirt?
Yes, you need to stop there.
Yeah, we did. So, of course, we did. We walked in there. They had lots of different ones, lots of colors, but I don't know. I thought this one looked suitably nonpartisan. So,
Yes.
17 North, here we are.
Yes, it's a lovely sweater, and I like the story.
Thank you. And what highway are you wearing today?
This is, I think it's Old Navy's finest.
Get me out of here. All right, on to issue one. Criticism continues to pour in, pun intended? Maybe. Regarding Premier Doug Ford's announcement last week to liberalize beer and wine sales in corner stores in Ontario. The government announced it would spend $225 million to end an agreement with the major brewers 1 year early in order to get beer and wine sales into more corner stores. Ford says that fulfills a major commitment he made in the last election campaign. Now, before we go through the criticisms of the announcement, let's get you the 411, and for that, we pass it to Mr. McGrath.
So the Master Framework Agreement that was signed by Kathleen Wynne's government about a decade ago was always going to end next year. This set the framework for sales of beer and wine in grocery stores. The Ford government negotiated a new deal with the beer store owners, which are three international brewers, we already had this announcement that it was going to allow the sale of beer and wine in corner stores. They have now accelerated to that timeline. It will begin rolling out over the summer, and by early September, though after Labor Day, which I find interesting, the government will allow corner stores to sell beer and wine. But as you mentioned, it comes with this substantial price tag. The government says this money is going to be protecting employees in existing beer store locations, and it will allow the owners to make upgrades to their facilities. Obviously, one of these issues, if we're going to start allowing beer sales in much wider locations, there's a concern that the beer store will simply lay off workers and close locations.
Which the Premier does not want to see happen. So, earlier this week, the Liberal leader, Bonnie Crombie, took to the microphones to react to this development, and you will not be shocked to hear she was less than impressed. Let's check out that clip.
Doug Ford isn't being honest with you. In fact, his government is giving $1 billion, $1 billion of your money to big brewers, major grocery chains, and big box American stores just to get beer in the stores 1 year early. It's $1 billion booze boondoggle.
$1 billion booze boondoggle.
Yes.
Good one. She does go on to say that she thinks that if you're going to spend $1 billion, it would make more sense not to do it on getting booze sold in corner stores a year early, but rather, do we have some things in healthcare we might want to spend it on? She thinks so. Do we have some things in education, maybe repairing some schools that are falling apart? She'd rather see that. She also, you heard, She used the figure $1 billion, not $225 million, which is the government's number. So what's the discrepancy here?
They are including that direct payment to the beer store, which we already mentioned. Then they have some other costs that they say this agreement entails. There's a rebate for products sold by beer stores for LCBO fees, as well as a discount to grocery stores who will be buying all of this beer and wine from the LCBO. Those changes in prices cumulatively will come to, they estimate, the Liberal Party estimates, will come to about $750 million.
Well, $750 million is a lot of money, but it's not $1 billion. So how do they get from 750 to $1 billion?
So even if we accept those estimates from the Liberals, this is, I think, where things get a bit trickier. How they get to $1 billion is by arguing that the province should be selling licenses to large grocery stores and larger convenience stores. They have estimated, based on the experience in Saskatchewan, that you could raise, conservatively, they say, $300 million for the price of, or the privilege of having a license. That's how you get to $1 billion. The government, on the other hand, says this kind of misses the point, right? The government wants to get as many stores participating in this new system as possible. They aren't looking to squeeze every nickel out of the system that they can. To maybe make a silly analogy here, but like from the government's perspective, this is like criticizing a bicycle for not being a pickup truck. It's just not what they want it to do.
You had a funny line there, You said the Liberals conservatively estimate. Can Liberals conservatively estimate?
Big L, small c.
I guess if conservatives can liberalize beer and wine sales, then Liberals can conservatively estimate.
Very well done, sir.
I'm going to make a little confession here. This story has fascinated me for going on almost 40 years now, because I am old enough to remember the day. You are not, but I am old enough to remember the days when, and I would do this with my dad when I was a little kid, you'd walk into the LCBO or the beer store, which we didn't call the beer store then. It was called Brewers Retail. And they were owned by a consortium of brewers that were all Canadian brewers, unlike today where they're all international multinationals. And you would go up to the counter and you would fill out on a pad with a pencil what you want. There was no product to be seen, sampled, forget it, but there was no product to be seen. It was literally an empty store, and you'd go out there, pen, pencil, you'd make your order, you'd give it to the guy, he would go into the back room and he would bring it out to you, because of course it would have been scandalous for people to have been in proximity of actual beer product.
Serving themselves, my God.
I mean, who knows what could happen, Anyway, we're not quite in those days anymore. But the first big attempt to liberalize beer sales in the province of Ontario came from the leader of the Liberal Party. You won't be surprised to hear. His name was David Peterson. I remember during the 85 election campaign, he was doing a campaign event at a corner store on Keele Street near York University in northwest Toronto. And I don't know why I remember this, but the guy's name who owned the store was Martin Baranek. Martin Baranek's corner store. And Mr. Peterson walked in there. He made the announcement. He said, we don't need these brewers having a monopoly on sales. Let's get it open up. Let's have beer and wine in the corner stores. He then won that election, I think in no small measure because of the forward-thinkingness of that policy. And then he went to try to do it, and he discovered it's really hard to do. There are a lot of special interests, a lot of stakeholders here, and he just actually couldn't get it done. But Doug Ford believes that this is one of those issues that will move the needle in terms of his own political popularity. And so he has decided to expend this money for the purposes of getting this done now. Spoiler alert here, JMM. When you and I do your column, my column later in our podcast, I'm going to suggest another mischievous reason why the Conservatives may be so anxious to make this thing happen now as opposed to waiting a year from now. So stay tuned.
Yes, we will be talking about that quite a bit. One last thing about this, and we had a bit of a chuckle about this earlier. You and I have seen a lot of political bumper stickers and slogans in our time, and most of the time I roll my eyes and I move on. We have already discussed some of the reasons why the $1 billion price tag may not be strictly accurate. But I will say I did chuckle at $1 billion booze boondoggle, which was then shortened by some to just $1 billion booze doggle.
Oh, that's good. That's good. You know what? Full marks for alliteration.
Yes.
And with that, we're on to issue 2. Well, there are some pretty firm rules in public service that you are supposed to use your government-issued email account whenever you are doing the people's business. But one thing we've learned over the past week through reporting done by Global News is that many people inside the current Ontario government are not doing that. In fact, they are doing considerable amounts of the public's business on their personal Gmail accounts. Why, you ask? He's got the answer. Why, I ask.
The short answer is that they seem to be trying to avoid freedom of information requests. Any document that is created on a government-owned device or a government computer is at least theoretically subject to Ontario's Freedom of Information and Privacy Protection Act. One way to get around that is to use a personal email account. It is also the case that private, like partisan business should not be done on government devices and on government accounts. And so political staffers necessarily have to navigate some of this stuff. The issue with the news this week is that some people, including the Premier's Chief of Staff, seem to be using private Gmail accounts to conduct government business. And so there have been reports of speaking in code about the Greenbelt scandal. That obviously looks suspicious when it comes, especially when it comes out in the news.
You think?
Just to sort of be clear about it here, the focus of reporting this week really has centered on the Premier's Chief of Staff, Patrick Sackville, and the issue of whether he is not just sharing information with political staff, but in fact directing them with government policy through these private channels.
The Premier and the Prime Minister and the Mayor of Toronto, incidentally, had a news conference Thursday morning, at which time the Premier was asked about this, and he basically said, I still have confidence in my Chief of Staff and he's not going anywhere. So this may be a story that a lot of people are interested in, but at the moment, it doesn't appear to be moving the yardsticks as far as the Premier of Ontario is concerned. I guess we should also ask here, these are pretty clear established practices. You are not supposed to use private Gmail accounts to do the public's business. Are there any penalties that come attached to doing that?
In theory, there could be. The Freedom of Information and Privacy Protection Act does contain a list of offenses that include things like misleading the Information and Privacy Commissioner. One of the allegations in this reporting from the New Democrats is that Sackville, in his testimony to the commissioner, seems to have said things that are contradicted by the documentary evidence, let me put it that way. So misleading the commissioner is one potential offense. There are others that in theory might apply, but the law also says you can't start a prosecution without the permission of the Attorney General, who is, of course, Doug Downey, a Tory MPP.
And it seems unlikely that the Conservative Attorney General of Ontario is going to give anybody permission to investigate the Conservative Premier of Ontario or the Conservative Premier of Ontario's Chief of Staff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It seems unlikely. The more realistic scenario at this point is that the consequences will be political and not legal. NDP leader Marit Stiles has already called for the Premier to dismiss his Chief of Staff over this. The Information and Privacy Commissioner, Patricia Kosame, has announced this week that she'll be releasing a report into the government's document handling practices, particularly regarding the Greenbelt scandal. This government has already been I would say very badly bruised by reports from other legislative officers like the Auditor General and the Integrity Commissioner. So this latest report could do even more damage.
We shall see. And with that, we're on to issue 3. The rules at Queen's Park have been very explicit. MPPs who want to participate in debates must use one of Canada's 2 official languages, English or French. Despite the fact Indigenous people have been here for 10,000 years, it was actually against the rules for any Indigenous language to be used during proceedings at Queen's Park. When New Democrat MPP Sol Mamakwa brought that to the attention of the Government House Leader Paul Calandra, Calandra agreed that made no sense at all. So both men worked to change a century-and-a-half-long practice. The first question ever asked by an MPP in neither English nor French happened this past Tuesday at Queen's Park.
Tinikkenamwat and Times Nabamwat. Geginoaga Knaganis Tamek Umamis Wekamek. Kanamawik. Times Niwat and Snabamwat Kateanoa.
Needless to say, that was a pretty special moment, and it ended with the Premier of the province walking across the floor of the legislature and hugging Sol Mamakwa, and I can tell you, that doesn't happen every day of the week either.
No, you and I have spoken before about how nice it is when the legislature has these moments of grace, maybe not as often as we would like. But these moments where MPPs can rise above the partisan rancor, I think this was a really lovely moment. MPP Mamakwa's mother was present. She got a happy birthday from MPPs.
That's right. It was her birthday that day, wasn't it?
It was very nice. And of course, Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler was also present. A very important moment for Indigenous people in Ontario.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are obviously some logistical things that have to be figured out around all of this. Why don't you tell us some of those?
Yeah, so the one of the hurdles to allowing this is that Mamakwa's words have to be translated, and there's like people who work at the legislature to do that work, and so when this becomes an issue in the future for future Indigenous MPPs, we hope Sol Mamakwa will not be the last one. They will have to actually, as they win their election, as they win their seat, they will have to advise the legislature which language they want to use, and it'll be the legislature's responsibility to hire translators, for example. They will thereafter. That's how they will then be able to participate in debates.
Mm-hmm. Let's hear now. Admittedly, those who are listening on podcast are going to have a bit of trouble here, so I'm going to have to describe it. But if you're watching this on television or a smartphone or your computer, Sheldon, let's put this up. This is what part of Hansard, of course, is the written record of every word that is spoken in that chamber. Here's what it looks like for last Tuesday. That is not English. That is not French. That is Sol Mamakwa's native language, which we would translate in English to Oji-Cree. And that's what it looks like in Hansard. So this was a pretty cool historic week at Queen's Park, I gotta say.
It was. And, this is obviously symbolic in some sense, but I do want to say it's not just symbolism. The written record at the legislature matters. When a court has to determine if a government is acting lawfully, one of the things that they look at is the record of legislative debates, right? A court has to try to determine legislative intent. I have seen more than one court case, including some from this government, where judges found a government to have acted badly, at least in part because of what was said in the chamber at Queen's Park. The record matters. And until this week, only English and French were afforded the legislative privilege of being part of the record. So while the changes this week, they don't end boil water advisories. They don't end any of the other disparities in treatment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada or in Ontario. It is also not trivial. And so I think it is worth praising the people who made it happen.
Yeah, Sol Mamakwa has said in the past that when he walks into the Ontario legislature, he feels like he is in a colonial presence, right? Like this is a form of government with which his people have had significant problems over the years.
Yes.
And yet he is expected to go there, represent constituents, and do it in a place where he feels like he's not welcome. And to his credit, Paul Calandra from the government side recognized the difficulty of that, and they worked it out so that this new development could happen. And Mamakwa said this past week that for the first time ever, he kind of felt at home, speaking his own language, at Queen's Park. That's a beautiful thing.
One of the backstory bits that I did like was when Mamakwa first went to Calandra and they were chatting about this, and he says, well, no, I'm not allowed to speak my language. And Calandra didn't believe him at first. He was like, no, of course you can. And he was like, no, I assure you I cannot. And once it sunk in, Calandra seems to have moved relatively briskly to make these changes happen.
Right on. Okay, and with that, let's check out the columns that JMM and I wrote about this past week. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I talk about the columns we wrote for TVO.org over this past week. And this week we are going to throw tradition to the wind. And I'm going to start us off, assuming you're okay with that.
I will cope. I will do some breathing exercises and I will let it go.
Okay, appreciate it very much. I wrote a column a couple of weeks back looking at a lot of the tea leaves surrounding politics these days and concluded that it sure looked to me like the Premier of Ontario was trying to create a set of circumstances leading to an early election call. And by early, I mean we have a fixed election date in the province of Ontario. We know today that all things being equal, the next election is supposed to take place June 4th, 2026. In other words, 2 years from now. I've seen plenty of evidence over the past few weeks, to be sure, that the Premier might want to go to the polls early. He had a press conference last week announcing the liberalized beer and wine sales that we talked about already. Nothing he said in that news conference dissuaded me that he is thinking of allowing the entire 2 years to pass before the next election. 6 times the Premier was asked by various reporters, will you confirm that the next election in the province of Ontario will take place June 4th, 2026, as the law provides? And 6 times he refused to answer the question. And in fact, it got so comical. His answers started getting so long and meandering. He started talking about Kathleen Wynne's record in job creation. He started talking about interest rate policies of the government of the Bank of Canada. Anything but actually being responsive to what the actual question was. You think I'm making this up? Take a look.
Is this a timing thing? You want to keep your options open when they're weak?
Well, again, I just want to get our agenda through. I want to continue building Ontario, creating more jobs. Do you remember the days that Kathleen Wynne went out and said, let's get rid of the manufacturing and we're going to be a service sector province? Around the world, people are talking about Ontario. They're in awe. That's what they are. I hear it every single day from foreign leaders, from ambassadors, from consul generals. We increase revenues through growth, not through gouging people. They're finding a really tough time. And a message to the Bank of Canada, lower these damn interest rates finally, because we have a housing crisis. We're pushing the economy forward, and you're trying to kill the economy, meaning trying to kill people. So I look forward to you reducing the interest rates when time comes in June here.
That was kind of a cut down version of one answer of multiple answers that went on minute after minute after minute after minute. And of course, it's not a scrum, so you can't really cut the Premier off. As you can see, it got kind of ridiculous, and it has put a ton of jet fuel into the speculation that there is going to be an early election call perhaps next spring, which would be 3 years into the 4-year term. Why would the Premier want to do that? You ask. You didn't ask, but I'm going to presume you ask. Well, number one, he would very much prefer to run against Justin Trudeau being in Ottawa, as opposed to having Pierre Poilievre in Ottawa, which is a possibility given the way the polls look today. We know how much there is a demonstrated track record of Ontarians preferring to have one party in power in Ottawa, a different party in power at Queen's Park. So there's that. Number two, the RCMP is investigating the Greenbelt malfeasance, potential malfeasance by the government. It would certainly behoove the Tories to want to go to the polls before, I'm not saying they will be, but if possible charges are laid, you'd want to go to the people before any of that was out there.
Better to go earlier than later.
Correct. Number three, the governing Conservatives have a lot of money in the bank. And anybody who's watching television these days, be it the Stanley Cup playoffs or Blue Jay baseball games, it seems like every other ad is, ain't Doug Ford a great guy? Isn't he just the most wonderful neighbor and he's going to get it done for you, et cetera, et cetera. The Liberals, whom they see as their biggest competition, have a new leader, very few candidates in place. No policy developed yet as it relates to the next election campaign. The NDP are doing fine on fundraising, but they're 20 points behind the Tories in the last poll I saw. So these are all reasons why I wrote this column, focusing on whether the Premier will exploit what appear to be a lot of tactical advantages that he has to call an early election. Sometimes the voters punish you if you go early, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes, if they like you, they're just content to let you go early. And that's what Doug Ford's people are trying to figure out right now, and that's why I wrote the column. What do you think of that?
Well, before I get to my column, I'm going to make a confession here before these cameras. When you wrote that first column a few weeks ago, I might not have thought you were nuts exactly, but I maybe kind of sort of rolled my eyes a bit. You know, in our business, there is always an impulse to speculate about a snap election call, or maybe there's going to be a change. You remember when Kathleen Wynne was Premier, there was a lot of speculation about maybe she would resign resign, and the Liberals would have a late leadership race to change premiers, that kind of thing. I thought you were getting a bit over your skis, if I'm honest.
I don't ski.
I will make this commitment. If we do, in fact, head to an early election, I will promise you now, I will buy you a box of affordable, economical gas station wine.
Thanks a lot, pal. You're a great sport. Thank you very much.
So with that out of the way, my column this week was also about the prospect of an early election.
Oh, now hang on a second. But do you now acknowledge, 2 weeks after the original column, and with reporters asking the question over and over and over again at I think it was 2 news conferences ago, would you now acknowledge that it's not such a dumb idea for...
Oh, no. In fact...
This is out there now.
A lot of the timing in that contract, this new contract that has been agreed to the beer store, really strongly suggests that they are putting a lot of energy and effort and money to making sure that they keep things quiet up until January 1st, 2025. 2026. So that makes me think that we're talking about a spring election in 2025.
Maybe he's just being mischievous. But on the other hand, maybe this is real.
And you can do mischief when you're the premier, right? Like you can psych out your opponents, and maybe you get everybody revved up for a potential election, and then it doesn't happen. I believe Ernie Eves did that in 2003. There's a lot of speculation about a spring election. It ended up getting called in the fall. All that said,
yes.
So I do in fact accept that we are likely to if nothing else, we're likely to continue talking about the prospects of a spring election. And the reason I wrote about that this week is because I think there's a lot of risk for the government in a spring election, particularly on the housing file. Shocker, McGrath wrote about housing again.
I'm just completely bamboozled that you would do such a thing. Not.
Housing, one of the biggest issues this government is facing, and one of the issues where they're facing the most criticism, because even by the government's own metrics, a lot of things are heading in the wrong direction. Housing starts are down. Rental starts in Toronto that had been doing well are now down again. Ontario is a bit, not exactly an outlier, but it is being outshone by provinces like BC and Nova Scotia, very different provinces. And so I don't think, despite what the Premier can talk about, I don't think it's just the Bank of Canada's interest rate policies. I think Ontario's policies are part of why we are seeing kind of dismal housing performance. And if they do a spring election, that means there's not enough time for them to change course. You can't change policy in the fall of 2024 and hope that in the housing sector, which is kind of a slow-moving super tanker, you can't turn it around that quickly. Meaning that in the spring of next year, we will still basically be talking about kind of a sluggish housing sector. So all of that is just a very long way of me saying there are real risks to a spring election, and perhaps it's riskier even than the government is anticipating.
Yep, fair enough. Both of those columns, incidentally, available on the TVO website, tvo.org. Just hunt around, you'll find them. Yeah, click on his picture, click on my picture, you'll find it. Now, just before we go to the mailbag, you know that at this time, we usually like to, if we can, give a little shout out to somebody who said something good, bad, or indifferent about the podcast this past week. And I mentioned off the top of the program that we had a crew in Sault Ste. Marie earlier this week to do some shoots. And when we were there was a guy named Riley Elder who walked up to me and said, he actually pulled out of his little case, he said, "Here's a book you might find interesting." Was a book I'd written. It was called Pakin and the Premiers. Anyway, so I thought, wow, that's kind of neat that a guy who's as young as Riley is reading this book, so I like that. And he just said, really enjoying the podcast. And I thought to myself, if somebody as young as Riley is enjoying the podcast, he is deep in the bowels of onpoli nerddom. But that's okay. He's our kind of guy. We like that.
Thank you, Riley.
Yes, thanks, Riley. And I hope you like the book as well. So, JMM, to the mailbag, if you would.
Right. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org. Here is this week's letter. Hello, Steve and JM. Listener from Calgary. The question is for Steve. Upon entering journalism school in 2003, my father gave me a copy of your books, The Life, The Seductive Call of Politics, and The Dark Side, The Personal Price of a Political Life. I still have both copies sitting on my desk today. It has helped me out a lot in forming questions to ask subjects of interviews, so thank you for those resources. In The Dark Side, you write, it's fashionable to think that politicians and diapers have one thing in common. They should be changed regularly, and for that same reason.
Good line, eh? It's a good line.
It's a good line.
Yeah.
I'd like to change the way Canadians view their public servants, but in all honesty, I can't do it alone. My question is, in 21 years since that book was published, do you think the public has changed their views on politicians for the better or worse? And have your views changed on politicians in that time? Regards, Christopher W. Brown.
Love this question. First of all, Christopher, please thank your father for me for getting you that book. That was a real solid of him. Has the public changed its views on politicians since I wrote that book? Absolutely. Unquestionably, unequivocally, yes. And for the worse. I don't think anybody's going to argue with me that we seem to think a lot less about our politicians today than we did a generation ago, and for a whole lot of legitimate reasons. People are crankier about issues around affordability. They are upset that public services don't work as well as they think they ought to. They see money being wasted by politicians, and they don't like that. They see politicians being inaccessible. Have you ever tried to call Queen's Park? Have you ever tried to call your MPP? Very difficult to get anybody on the phone these days. You get a lot of voicemail recordings, and that's about it. And of course, beyond that, social media is ginning everybody up to be more toxic, not more understanding. As a result, on the other side, I hear more and more stories from more and more politicians about how, for the first time in their lives, they are really feeling very vulnerable to attacks from their constituents, actual attacks, which of course is unacceptable. We cannot have, in this province or country, we can't have people physically harming or attacking our politicians, because then, of course, security will become even more oppressive and we'll have even less access. So I'm still trying to see the glass half full on this one. I still believe in the main that the vast majority of people who run for office, who get involved in public life, do so because they want to make a contribution. I believe that. I see evidence of that. However, I'm also seeing a lot of evidence these days of something called the monetization of outrage. Too many politicians manufacturing fake outrage during question period, putting clips of themselves asking tough questions to a premier or a prime minister who may not even be there, and then sending those clips out on social media to fundraise off them. I think it's a really unfortunate practice. And so, Christopher, this aspect of politics today is definitely worse than it was before. That's my 2 cents. You got a view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say briefly that I think we have to do our jobs as reporters to sometimes tamp down on the outrage when we can. Sometimes there are legitimate outrages. We spent a lot of last year angry about the Greenbelt, and I don't think the government, given that the government reversed itself, they're not going to defend those choices anymore. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there are legitimate outrages, and sometimes it takes journalists to say, to explain things. Sometimes things aren't as outrageous as they seem. And that's hard because in the social media environment we're in now, one of the riskiest things you can do is try and say, actually, everybody just hold on a second, calm down. This is not as bad as it looks. I've had some experience with that. It's not fun. But we keep trying to do it, and I hope that our audience can make a mental practice of it, of taking a breath before you give in to the anger on social media.
I'll tell you, that's one of the reasons we went to Sault Ste. Marie last week. We did an episode of TVO Today Live, which again is this show that we do in the community in front of a live audience, Q&A with the audience. We flew a bunch of guests up to Sault Ste. Marie for this, and the question we debated was, can you be a good citizen and be angry at the same time? And the answer clearly is yes. Feigned anger, fake anger, no, not interested in that. Genuine, authentic anger that leads to constructive action that may result in a policy change that you want, absolutely. That is perfectly consistent with democracy. But a lot of the fake BS and crap we see on social media nowadays, I don't know how constructive or helpful that is.
Thank you, Christopher, for the question.
I got to say, that airs June 13th. Oh. June 13th, prime time, I guess. It's probably on at 9 o'clock at night or something like that. Anyway, as they used to say, consult your local listings for further details.
Again, if you'd like to ask about content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, May 31st, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Just write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org and be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced by Maya Abramson, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell, Christine Gardner, Carla Lucetta, and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks, as always, to our studio crew for making this podcast look so darn good. And until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.